Hi, my name's Simin Ganatra, and I'm first violinist of the Pacifica Quartet.
And I'm Brandon Vamos, and I'm the cellist, and we are half of the quartet today to have a discussion about Shostakovich and the quartet's beginnings and answer some of the audience's questions. So, shall we start?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, we're really sorry that we couldn't come play in Sleepy Hollow. I was really looking forward to it. I had heard so much about Sleepy Hollow, and I hope we'll get a chance to actually come play for you live at some point.
This would have been our first performance.
That's right.
There, so.
Yeah. Okay, so we have some questions that you guys submitted, and we thought we would take some time to answer those. So the first question is, tell us about the Pacifica Quartet. How did you meet, and how do you work together? Do you want to take that one?
Sure. That was a long time ago. 26 years ago, 1994 was when we started, and we knew each other before then. We met, you must have been around 14.
Yeah, I was 14, that's right.
Yeah.
When I was 14 years old, I grew up in Los Angeles originally, but when I was 14, I left home to go study with some amazing violin teachers who happened to be Brandon's parents, Roland and Almeda Vamos. So they were living in Minneapolis at the time, and I went and I lived with them and studied with them to finish out my high school years. But we didn't really know each other then because you were away at college.
True. Yes.
So so Brandon and I first started playing together when we were teenagers. I was a teenager. You were also a teenager. At summer music festivals. We got just randomly kind of put in a quartet together. And so that was, I guess, the very first beginnings of the Pacifica Quartet. And I know for me personally, I was always looking for quartet members, people who would be as passionate about playing this repertoire as I was. So all throughout high school, really, and college, I was always thinking, okay, who might want to do this with me? So when I finally had a group, kind of formed, Brandon was the first cellist I called. And who would know, look at us later, we're not only quartet mates, but we're also married as well.
Yeah, I think I also, probably similar to you, I had a desire to play chamber music when I was young, and those festivals were very influential in the summer. But also when I went to study at Eastman with Paul Katz, who was the cellist of the Cleveland Quartet, and he was a huge influence. I loved the quartet. I loved going to their concerts. I loved hearing him talk about his life and especially the repertoire. And I think that's probably the main reason why most string quartet players want to be in a quartet, because some of the greatest music ever written was written for the string quartet by all the great composers like Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, Mendelssohn, Brahms, etc., Shostakovich. I think we feel lucky that this is our career, and it was hard at first, wouldn't you say?
It was. So when we started the quartet, of course, we didn't have any concerts or any possible job. I was finishing up at Oberlin, where I went to school, and Brandon was finishing up at Yale. And that first year, we just kind of met with the other two members. We would meet on vacations and weekends sometimes, and we were trying to get a recording together so that we could get into one of the summer festivals. And so we did that, and we got the fellowship position at Aspen Music Festival. And that summer was the first time we really got to work together full time. We loved it. We felt an immediate chemistry. And so the group decided then to just kind of take a leap of faith, and we moved to Chicago to study with the Vermeer Quartet. And for those first several years, our days were spent, we would rehearse from 9 to 5, and we would always take an hour lunch in the middle from 12 to 1. And we just got through so much repertoire. We went through the Beethoven quartets, the Haydn quartets. I'm not sure, did we do any Shostakovich then? I don't think we did yet. That was later. Mozart. It was just such a wonderful time to really explore the quartet repertoire together. We didn't have any money, obviously, because we were just playing string quartets and not really playing concerts or anything yet. So we would all teach young kids on the weekends and sometimes in the evening hours to kind of make ends meet. And then we were lucky enough, I think in our third year together, we won Concert Artists Guild competition, which gave us management and then concerts.
Yeah, and that was huge because all of a sudden we had something to rehearse for, and we had that experience of getting up on stage and trying out that repertoire that we had been studying for those first couple of years, and just getting that experience, getting our feet wet, was, I think it really kept us together and gave us something to work towards. It was exciting.
It was, yeah. There was a second part to that question, which let me see if I can pull that up again. Okay. It says, oh, and how do you work together? That's a really good question. A lot of people think string quartets, you just all learn your parts and then you get together and you just try to, you just play together and it just magically works. String quartets notoriously rehearse a lot. And the reason is because we don't have a conductor telling us what to do. We're a democracy, so we all have equal voices. So, that takes a lot more time to discuss things, how we want to take time at the end of a phrase, or how much crescendo do we want to do, or what is the character of this section, or sometimes even what is the first voice, the most important voice, and what's the commentary voice. So things like that are all up for discussion. Early on in the quartet, we had this great session with one of our important mentors, James Dunham of the Cleveland Quartet, and he talked to us about how in string quartet, a great string quartet never compromises, rather they come to a consensus. So this is something I think that has stuck with us, and we always try to go for that consensus, because of course if you compromise, if somebody wants to take time at the beginning of a phrase and thinks that that's the way this is going to be the most meaningful way to present it, and somebody else says, no, we should do it completely straight, then that person, the compromise might be, well, let's take a little bit of time. But really then neither person ends up feeling like it's the best way to present this particular phrase. So we've always tried to come to this consensus, and with the idea that when we walk out onto stage, it's not Austin's interpretation of Mozart or Brandon's interpretation of Shostakovich. It's the Pacifica Quartet's interpretation. And nobody is, we want to come to a point where nobody feels like they're compromising on their musical ideas. And it actually is that way in everything. I mean, there's so many decisions that a quartet has to make together, not just musical decisions. Where we want to live, do we want to take this job, do we want to travel overseas for this concert, all of those kinds of things, and we all have to really feel good about everything we're doing.
What's the next question, Simin?
Okay, I will read the next question. Having played and recorded all 15 Shostakovich quartets, what is special to you about the second quartet? Well, I mean, they are really 15 fantastic works, masterpieces. Each one is a great quartet. Sorry about the extra noise. This is our friend over here. This is our dog.
Willis. And he's been trying to get my attention the whole time here. So, often you hear the 8th String Quartet. That's his most famous quartet and sort of his autobiographical work, and it's a fantastic piece. And the 3rd String Quartet is played a lot, but a lot of the others are not heard as often. And the 2nd Quartet is one of them, and it's a little surprising to me because the first time I heard it and the first time we played it, it just stood out to be a remarkable piece. And even the reaction of the audience, I remember, was sort of electric. And if I were to say what's special about this quartet, there's a sort of an operatic feel to it. Even the title of the first movement is Overture, and the second movement is recitative and romance. And one of the things about Shostakovich is that early in his life he stopped writing operas because of the trouble he was getting into with the authorities, the danger that was creating in his life. But I think he wanted to have that operatic feel, and he wanted to say something without words, which was perfect for the quartet medium. And so there's definitely this very personal feeling in this quartet, this singing, this plaintive, almost cantatorial, like longing, especially the second movement, which I think is absolutely beautiful. And that's a big the singer is Simin, the first violin, and the other three of us are holding these long pedal tones. The other thing that stands out to me about the third quartet is the third movement, which is a scherzo, which is generally the light, joking movement of a quartet. Now, Shostakovich doesn't treat his scherzos like that often, and there's something dark and brooding and behind the surface of his scherzo. And the other thing that's, I think, remarkable is that we are played muted. We put our mutes on the entire movement, and but the color of the movement is not soft. It's often forte and fortissimo. So this feeling of playing something muted, yet giving everything you have, this sort of like restraint that's put into the music, I think speaks to a lot of what Shostakovich was going on in his life, that he was full of restraint. He was being restrained by so many forces, yet there was such power for him to express in the music. These are the things that I love about this quartet. I also love the last movement because he brings out all the folk music of Russia, and that's something that he was, in a way, expected to do by the Soviet government. But it's a big work. It's over about 35 minutes long. I think it's the second longest quartet, and it's epic in proportion, and it's a journey. And yeah,
you sort of already touched on this, but one of the great things about the Shostakovich quartets in general is, I think, as Brandon said, when he would write his larger scale works like his symphonies and his operas, they were very much out in the public, and there was this fear that he would do something that the authorities wouldn't like, and so he was always afraid to be really intimate and experimental because of what might happen, and certainly that did happen to him. But in his quartets, he was writing his quartets for his friends, and they were much more under the radar. So I feel like we get the really personal Shostakovich, and he really does try some things that he might not have felt comfortable to try compositionally in his bigger, more public works.
That's true, because the quartets would not have been performed in such public venues like his symphonies and his operas.
There's incredible raw emotion in this piece, and when I play the second movement, the recitative that I was talking about, you just feel this throughout your entire system, this incredible emotion. It's just lying bare. It's really an amazing, amazing thing to experience, both, I think, as a listener and a player.
Do you have any thoughts, Willis? No? Okay.
Okay, let's see what the next question is. Okay, I lost it. Find the questions again.
Questions. Here they
there
are.
we go. Okay. Somebody says, I would be interested in a musical history lesson about Shostakovich. Okay, that's a good question. Yeah.
Should we begin the lesson?
Yes.
Okay, everybody
Sure.
take your seats.
Okay.
Well, Shostakovich's life is so interesting to read about because of the hardships that he endured, the struggles. It was a very repressive regime, obviously, and there were very strict rules about what a composer could and could not do. And if Shostakovich didn't follow these rules carefully, the consequences were dire. And so, for this reason, Shostakovich lived a good deal of his life in fear. And there are stories about Shostakovich, with a suitcase packed by the door, because they would come for you at night, supposedly, and he was always worried that he wanted to spare his family that humiliation. But I think he was born in the beginning of the 20th century, around 1906, I think. I think he died in 1975. He wrote his first symphony at age 20. It was a big success. And I think things were going pretty smoothly early on for him, and he was very successful, really well thought of in Russia. And it wasn't until he wrote his opera Lady Macbeth in 1934, and it was very well received and good reviews, and people liked it. They were going to it. It was performed many times. I think it was even performed in the West. until one evening performance where Stalin was there with his entourage, and right before the last act, stormed out. And as you can imagine, this was very terrifying for Shostakovich. And a couple days later, in the Soviet mouthpiece Pravda, there was an article, and the title was "Muddle Instead of Music." And it condemned Shostakovich for things being too dissonant, not too Western, loud and brash, and the content was not for the people. It was not proletarian enough, I guess.
Too bourgeois.
Too bourgeois. And at that point, he knew he was in trouble, and there was a lot of fear, and he was condemned by people who had formerly said great things about him. And he lost a lot of work, and it was a really tough time. He also had, at this point, wrote his fourth symphony and decided not to have it played because there was quite a bit of dissonance in it, so he withdrew before the first performance. Mm-hmm. And then he writes his fifth symphony, and all of a sudden he's back in good grace with everybody. He uses certain things that are appease the authorities, even though there's a lot of hidden meaning in that symphony, as we know now. But it was always up and down with him in his life, where he was. And so I always find it interesting when we're playing one of his quartets. What was going on? Was he being brought in to discuss something about one of his works? Were people supporting him? What was the background behind that quartet? He also had another troublesome period, I think it was in 1948, after the war, after he wrote the second quartet. It had to do with his 7th and 8th symphonies. They were both written during the war. The 7th symphony is in the beginning of the war when things aren't going well and it's triumphant. And the 8th symphony is at the end of the war when things are going great and it's tragic. And I think that people read into that, saying, well, is he really supportive? And it's kind of amazing to think that the authorities would be so focused on what an artist was doing. I mean, can you imagine that happening today? I don't think any of us could, but he was really under the radar, and there was a certain sense for a composer that they had to stick to the guidelines of social realism. Music couldn't be too dissonant, it had to be tuneful, it had to use folk music, it had to be for the people, and so you had to sort of, somehow Shostakovich was able to stick to this guideline, and he might have been very influenced by Western composers and gone off on a different path, but because of this, something magical happens in the music. Maybe it's because of all that repression. I guess we'll never know what his music would have been like, but so that's a little bit of background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have anything to add on that, or?
Well, I mean, I'm looking through the questions, and there's more questions about Shostakovich. What place did Shostakovich hold in the music world in the 20th century? How did he survive the brutal tactics of the Russian communist regime? How does his music express that frustration and urgency to explode to freedom? And in simple terms, why is he so close to your hearts that you were compelled to record and perform so much of his music?
Okay, that's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question, but we've talked about some of that already. I mean, Shostakovich was really, at the time, people didn't really know how he felt. He was kind of careful. He didn't want to be put in the spotlight as somebody who was a formalist or something. So, his string quartets play a really important role because there we get to, as I said before, get to see really his voice. And I think that was one of the ways that he did survive as a composer. And the quartets, there's 15 of them. And it's some of the most innovative music. I mean, in the 13th quartet, at one point it sounds like jazz. And we're playing with our bow hair rubbing against the body of the instrument. This is something that, wasn't done at the time, or Shostakovich wouldn't have known that was happening. And not what we normally think of when we think of Shostakovich doing those kind of really extended techniques.
I guess that was written near the end of his life after Stalin's death, where there was some more freedom, and so he had a little bit more flexibility at that point.
But it's interesting for me. I think there was a time, actually, probably in the 70s, when everybody, Shostakovich was very much in favor and played a lot in the West, and his life story was told a lot. During the Cold War, it was like, so much of going to Shostakovich concert was about hearing about his life. For me, that's not really how I came to Shostakovich's music and why I love it so much. I mean, I guess what happened in his life, of course, is important, and it's important to know as a musician, interpreting his music, but this music really speaks to me, and it's very accessible in so many ways. I mean, as I said before, like, it's just this really raw emotion coming to the surface. And if you look at his scores, they look incredibly sparse, often just one voice playing at a time. There's not a whole lot of big writing, or when we are playing 4 voices, very often 2 of those voices will be in octaves. So it's like 3 voices or 2 voices instead of 4. So it's not incredibly dense writing. It's in a way kind of sparse, but there's just something so meaningful to every note. And I think it's very, it is, as I said, it is important to know about his incredible journey in his life with Stalin and all the horrible things that he had to endure. But even without that, the music really does, for me, stand for itself.
That's an interesting part of the question, though. Like, how did he overcome the regime and other restrictions that were put on him? And I think he did it. There's a lot of little things in the music that sort of are little hints at what was going on in his life. For example, I mentioned the mutes in the 3rd movement of the scherzo, the waltz of the second quartet.
Sarcasm and irony in his music too, all over the place. He has quotes. The 8th quartet, he has he spells out his own name. It's autobiography quartet, and so he spells out D, so he uses a D natural, and then S is an E flat, E S S, C H for Dmitri Shostakovich, so C and then H, which would be a B natural, and that da-dee is all throughout the 8th quartet, and actually it's in all of his quartets.
Yeah. I think the other thing is, people often ask about Shostakovich is, well, why didn't he have more courage? Why didn't he stand up to the authorities? And I've always thought about that, but, I think he had 2 choices. He could be a martyr, and he would have ended up in a camp or worse, or he could write some amazing music. He had a family. He had children. I mean, I think I understand it. I understand what he had to do. He was very careful not to hurt anybody, and he also did find times to stand up for people. I think he was very attached to Jewish culture and had many Jewish friends. And
you hear that in the 2nd quartet so vividly.
2nd quartet and the 4th quartet. Yes. There's a klezmer movement. But he did stand up for people in that regard, and he did have a lot of courage, but I think he really had no choice. He was put in a position where he had to survive, and I think there's something in that survival mode and that the despair that he was going through that makes this music so good. It's a lot like Beethoven. Beethoven had incredible struggles, and in a way, I think that struggle comes out in the music, and that's how it's so personal. I mean, I think what you were saying is that the music really can speak to one person in the audience. It has, like Schumann has that ability as well. It's very personal. It can be full of grief, and there can be layers of that. Sometimes the grief is like for all of humanity, and sometimes it's for one person. His music is so broad, and I think that's why we were so attracted to these quartets.
Yes.
And we started off playing number 8, which I grew up listening to as a high school student. Everybody loves that quartet when they're in high school, and it's just so exciting and so deep. And then we played number 3, and then we started looking at some of these other quartets that weren't played, and every one was great. Why is that not any less played than, why is 5 not played like 3 is? And why is we had that thought, and then we started learning more, and eventually we said, let's do a cycle.
Yes, they're all great.
Yeah.
And they're great as a journey to hear. If you ever get a chance to hear the Shostakovich Quartet cycle, as one cycle is a journey. It's just an incredible experience.
Yeah. I miss playing Shostakovich cycles. We haven't done one in a
I
while.
miss playing live concerts.
Which is another thing to talk about, I guess.
Yes.
We haven't played a concert since
March 13th was our last concert.
Oh, you got the date. Yeah, March
Yes.
13th.
We were playing a concert that night in Sarasota, Florida. And as we walked off the stage, we learned that luckily it was at the end of the concert, we learned that the concert hall was now closed because of COVID restrictions. And we flew home the next morning and have been in Bloomington, Indiana, where we live ever since. The longest time I think we've ever spent at home.
Sure.
But it's been a wonderful summer. You can probably hear our children in the background. So we've had a lot of family time, which has been great. But
yeah. Yeah, it's been nice. I mean, of course we miss performing, and that's really hard because that's been something we've been doing for 25 years and traveling and those things. But having time to reflect and be home and
we're rehearsing a lot still. We've converted our garage into a rehearsal space. We open the doors and we social distance, we wear masks, and we rehearse every day in the garage, the quartet, and we're learning new repertoire, and we're playing a lot of virtual concerts. So we'll record something and send it. And yeah, it's been good in some ways too.
But of course we're anxious to get back out and to eventually get to Sleepy Hollow and perform for you and just keep on doing what we want to be doing. I mean, we're still teaching, which is also interesting because a lot of our teaching is online, and that's a new skill.
That is, yes. Right. Yeah. Well, but thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy this performance of the Shostakovich Second Quartet.
Thank you. Take care.